Chapter 1. The Prologue, Echoes of the Past. In the gloom of a moonless night, the forest exuded an almost supernatural silence, broken only by the distant sound of wind sweeping through ancient trees. Among the shadows dancing to the rhythm of the breeze, something seemed to be watching. No one knew exactly how long the forest had been there, but the nearby villagers always spoke of it with a mix of fear and reverence. It was a place children avoided during their games, where hunters never ventured beyond the edge, and where tales of disappearances were whispered around campfires. Years ago, it was said, a man named Elias lived in isolation near the forest. Elias had no family, only a small cabin at the edge of the woods, and he was known for his obsession with exploring it, something no one else dared to do. One night, as the winds howled and the sky seemed to press down on the earth, Elias recorded a final message on an old tape recorder that now sat dusty on the shelf of an antique shop. The forest knows. It feels. It's not a place. It's something. And it's hungry. The following morning, the cabin was found empty. There was no sign of Elias, only footprints leading into the heart of the forest before vanishing. The tape recorder became a forgotten curiosity, much like Elias's legend, told only by superstitious elders on stormy nights. Yet, for those who heard his words, something in them continued to linger. Present day. So, what's the story again? Some crazy guy went into the forest and never came back. Lucas asked, laughing as he unzipped his backpack. It's more than that, Lucas. People say that anyone who goes and hears things, whispers that know you, Clara replied, adjusting the straps of her backpack with a hesitant glance toward the forest's edge. Oh, sure, the big whispering forest. I'll admit it's a great name for a horror story, said Marcos, the skeptic of the group, with a muffled laugh. That weekend, Clara, Lucas, Marcos, and Renata were determined to explore the forest. The plan was simple: spend 2 days camping, test their limits, and return with stories to tell. They didn't yet know that it wouldn't just be the forest testing them, but also their own demons. Chapter 2. The Illusion of Normalcy. The path to the forest was filled with laughter and playful banter. Lucas, as always, led the way with an almost childlike enthusiasm, while Clara walked just behind, carefully observing her surroundings. Renata, more introspective, stayed in the middle of the group, occasionally snapping photos of the landscape with her camera. Marcos, bringing up the rear, muttered sarcastic remarks each time someone stumbled over the roots protruding from the ground, like hands trying to grab them. Looks like nature doesn't want us here, he said after tripping for the second time. Maybe it just doesn't want you, Lucas replied with a grin, earning laughs from Clara and Renata. At first glance, the forest's entrance seemed ordinary. Sunlight filtered through the treetops, casting golden patterns on the ground. The sound of birds and rustling leaves gave the impression that everything was in perfect harmony. But as the group ventured further, the light began to fade, and silence settled over them. Strange. I thought we'd hear more birds, Clara remarked, breaking the quiet. Renata glanced around, as if searching for something she couldn't quite explain. Yeah, it's too quiet. Quiet is good, Marcos said. It means we're far from civilization. No noise, no Wi-Fi, just peace. And maybe a few whispers, Lucas teased, winking at Clara, who shot him a warning look. After a few hours of hiking, the group found a perfect clearing to set up camp. It was spacious, with a circle of tall trees surrounding it like a protective embrace. Yet Clara couldn't shake the chill that ran through her as she looked at the trees. They seemed to lean inward, as if bowing toward the clearing's center. I think we should set up the tents close to each other, she suggested, trying to dismiss the unsettling feeling. With the tents pitched and a fire crackling, the friends settled in to enjoy the evening. Lucas began telling an improvised ghost story, exaggerating the details to provoke laughter. Marcos, ever the skeptic, interrupted at every turn, debunking the narrative with absurd scientific explanations. But as the laughter echoed through the clearing, Renata remained silent, staring into the darkness between the trees. There was something there, a barely perceptible movement, a sound so faint she almost believed she'd imagined it. "Renata, you okay?" Clara asked, lightly touching her friend's shoulder. "Yeah, it's probably just the wind," Renata replied, forcing a smile. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. That night, as everyone slept, the forest silence became suffocating. Then, in the depths of the darkness, the whispers began. Chapter 3. The First Whisper. Renata woke up abruptly, her heart racing. For a moment, she had no idea where she was. The darkness of the forest seemed to envelop her entirely, like a suffocating shroud. She strained to hear any familiar sound, the crackling of the campfire, Lucas's snoring, or even the wind in the trees. But there was only silence. Then she heard it. It was faint, almost imperceptible, yet impossible to ignore. A voice whispered her name. "Renata?" She sat up inside the tent, clutching her backpack as though it could shield her. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. But instead of an answer, the sound became clearer, as if it were right next to her. "It's your fault." The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She knew exactly what it was referring to, but she refused to think about it. Not here. Not now. Summoning all her strength, she shut her eyes and covered her ears, trying to convince herself it was just a dream. In another tent, Clara was also awake. The whisper reached her like a cold breeze slipping through the tent's opening. It was a familiar voice, one she hadn't heard in years. "Why didn't you save me?" Her chest tightened. Her mind fought against the memory that haunted her, but it was no use. She knew exactly what she was hearing. Her sister's face, the screams of that fateful night, it all came rushing back like a punch to the gut. Outside, Lucas was sitting near the extinguished campfire, staring at the still smoldering embers. He heard it too, but unlike the others, the voice calling to him was sweet, seductive. "You don't have to pretend, Lucas. You know who you really are." He shook his head, trying to push the thought away. "It's just exhaustion," he muttered to himself. Just exhaustion. Meanwhile, Marcos, the skeptic of the group, remained sound asleep, blissfully unaware of the terror unfolding around him. The next morning, no one mentioned the whispers. There were averted glances and weary expressions, but no one dared to speak of what they had heard. Renata looked especially pale, and Clara's distant stare didn't go unnoticed by Lucas, though he chose not to comment. "Did everyone sleep well?" Marcos asked, breaking the silence. "Yes," the others replied in unison, too quickly. But the forest knew, and the whispers had only just begun. Chapter 4. The Noose Tightens. The second day in the forest began under a cloudy sky, as though the world itself mirrored the heaviness each of them felt. The group moved about uneasily, avoiding meaningful conversation as they packed up camp to venture deeper into the woods. No one wanted to admit it, but something had changed since the previous night. "Rough night for everyone, huh?" Lucas tried to joke, forcing a smile, but the response was just a scattered murmur. Clara adjusted her backpack without replying, while Renata looked away. As they progressed along the trail, the air seemed heavier, as though the forest itself was closing in around them. Each step echoed unnaturally among the trees, which now appeared taller and closer. The silence, once peaceful, now felt suffocating. "Do you feel that?" "It's darker," Clara said hesitantly. "It's just your imagination," Marcos replied, his carefree tone sounding more like he was reassuring himself than the others. But they all felt it. The forest was no longer the same. It was Lucas who found the first sign that something was wrong. A small notebook lay nestled among the roots of a gnarled tree, its leather cover faded and smeared with dirt. He crouched to pick it up, but hesitated, a chill running down his spine. "Check this out," he said, holding up the notebook for the others to see. "Probably someone who passed through here," Marcos said dismissively. But Clara stepped closer, taking the notebook with trembling hands. When she opened it, her face went pale. This can't be real." Renata and Lucas leaned in to look. Scrawled across the pages were disjointed phrases, like whispers captured in writing. "Why didn't you save me? It's your fault, always your fault. They know who you are." Renata stepped back, her heart racing. She recognized those words. They were exactly what she had heard the night before. "Okay, this isn't funny anymore," Lucas said, trying to sound calm, though his voice betrayed him. "Someone's playing tricks on us," Marcos insisted, but even he sounded less certain now. Later, as they explored a denser part of the forest, Renata saw something that made her blood run cold. Dangling from a twisted branch was a pendant that had belonged to her younger sister, the same sister who had died years ago. She grabbed it, gasping, painful memories flooding back. But before she could say anything, Clara screamed. When the group rushed to her, they saw what had terrified her. At the base of a tree was a black and white photograph. It showed the four of them, but the image looked old, as if it had been taken decades earlier. "This doesn't make sense," Clara murmured, her voice trembling. But the forest didn't need to make sense. It only needed to feed. Chapter 5. Divided in the Abyss. Panic began to creep into the group like a shadow, silent but inevitable. The discovery of the photo and the notebook brought forth a truth none of them wanted to face. Something was toying with them. Something knew them intimately. "Someone must be following us," Marco stated, trying to provide a rational explanation. "Maybe some lunatic living out here, or I don't know." "And how do you explain the photo?" Clara retorted, clutching the yellowed paper between her fingers. "It looks old, but it's us." "That's impossible," Marcos insisted, though his voice wavered. Renata stayed silent. The pendant in her hand was a reminder of what she had lost, a fragment of pain she had never overcome. Her heart felt heavy, but she couldn't put into words what she was experiencing. Lucas, usually the most talkative, was now visibly shaken. He scanned the forest around them as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows at any moment. Maybe it's the forest," he finally said, his voice tinged with hesitation. "Oh, sure. The forest is alive and messing with us," Marcos quipped sarcastically, but no one laughed. "What if it is?" Clara whispered, her eyes fixed on the trees. Tensions rose as the day wore on. Each of them began to drift apart, lost in their own thoughts and fears. The group, which once moved together, now felt disjointed. Renata felt an invisible weight pressing on her chest. Memories of her sister, so vivid in the past few days, were eating away at her. While the others argued, she heard the whisper again. "You abandoned her, Renata. Wasn't there anything more important?" She spun around abruptly, but saw no one. The whispers were inside her now, impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Clara felt a constant presence, as if someone were watching her. As she passed a tall, gnarled tree, she saw a familiar face carved into its bark, her sister's face. The image seemed alive, its eyes following her every move. "No, this can't be real," she murmured, stepping back. Lucas began to talk more to himself, the whispers seeping into his mind like a soft poison. He didn't dare share them with the others, but his behavior grew increasingly erratic. Finally, even Marcos, the only one clinging to logic, started to hear them. "You know, they don't trust you, Marcos. They never have." By the time night fell again, the group was on the verge of collapse. What had once been camaraderie had now given way to distrust and isolation. The forest, silent and watchful, tightened its grip around them, and one by one, they began to drift apart, each pursued by their own whispers. Chapter 6. Confronting the Demons. The third night in the forest was darker than the ones before. The sky was starless, and the absence of the moon left the darkness absolute. The campfire, now just a small flicker of light, felt insignificant against the oppressive vastness surrounding them. The group was visibly shaken. The silence among them wasn't just uncomfortable. It was thick with suspicion and fear. "We need to get out of here." Clara finally broke the silence. Her voice was firm, but her eyes betrayed the growing panic. "And go where?" Marcos asked. "Do you even know how to get back? Everything here looks the same. We're walking in circles." Renata, who had been silent throughout the argument, raised her head. "What if it doesn't want us to leave?" "What?" Marcos laughed nervously. "You're talking about the forest again? Come on, Renata, this is all psychological. We're tired, scared, and our minds are playing tricks." "That's it. It's not just that," Lucas muttered, staring into the darkness. His expression was different now, tense, as if something inside him was on the verge of breaking. "And you know it." The whispers were louder that night, impossible to ignore. Each of them was being forced to face their deepest fears, their darkest secrets. Clara, who always avoided talking about her sister, saw her face reflected in the shadows of the trees. Her sister's eyes seemed to accuse her, filling her with guilt. "I tried to save you," Clara whispered, not realizing she was speaking out loud. "I tried, but I was just a child." Renata watched Clara, but was consumed by her own torment. The pendant she'd found felt heavier with each passing moment. She knew what the forest wanted her to remember. The day she left her younger sister alone at home, just for a few minutes. The fire had been fast, and she had never forgiven herself. Marcos, on the other hand, began to feel something even more insidious. The whispers turned into voices mocking him, repeating words from his past, words of former classmates and family members. "You were never good enough." A failure disguised as arrogance. Lucas, however, seemed almost resigned. He knew the forest was exposing the truth he'd worked so hard to hide, the satisfaction he felt in manipulating others, the mask he wore to appear the perfect friend. The breakdown happened quickly. Each of them began acting unpredictably, trapped in their own cycles of torment. Clara strayed from the group, following the voice of her sister, which seemed to call to her. Renata tried to stop her, but was ignored. "Don't go alone, Clara," Renata shouted, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. Marcos began yelling at no one in particular, as if arguing with something invisible. He was losing control, kicking the ground and cursing, while Lucas watched, growing more distant. It was Lucas who, for the first time, looked into the void and whispered, "Maybe the forest isn't testing us. Maybe it's showing us who we really are." And so, one by one, the friends started to drift apart. The voices in their heads grew louder, and the forest knew it was winning. The night felt endless. Chapter 7. The Final Whisper. Morning brought no relief. The darkness of the previous night lingered over the group, like a dense cloud refusing to lift. The forest was utterly silent, save for the sound of the friends' scattered footsteps. Each of them was isolated, trapped by their own inner demons. The camaraderie and friendship that had once bound them were gone. Only tense faces and hollow stares remained. Renata was the first to attempt action. She knew something had to be done before it was too late, but her mind was fragmented, spiraling in guilt and regret. Her sister's pendant still rested in her hand, feeling heavier with each passing moment, as though she were holding her own condemnation. "Clara," she called desperately, pushing through the trees. "You can't keep doing this." A whisper came, but not from the forest. It was her sister's voice, soft and mocking, as though she were standing right beside her. "You never saved her. You'll never be good enough." Renata's legs gave way, and she fell to her knees, tears streaking down her face. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, choking on the weight of her remorse. She glanced around, hoping to find Clara, but the forest swallowed everything in its path, leaving only an oppressive void. Clara, meanwhile, was elsewhere in the forest, standing frozen before a gnarled tree. Her sister's face seemed carved into its bark, watching her with lifeless eyes. The whispers intensified, wrapping around her like vines, threatening to choke her. "You could have saved me," the voice accused. "You knew what was happening. Don't try to deny it." I couldn't do anything," Clara murmured, clutching her head as though to block out the relentless accusations. But the voices didn't stop. The air grew heavier, and the shadows around her began to shift, taking on twisted, ominous forms. Deep down, she knew she couldn't escape the guilt clawing at her soul. Elsewhere, Marcos stumbled through the forest in a near catatonic state. His eyes were glazed, his movements erratic, but the voices remained sharp and cutting. "You failed. You're nothing but a fraud." The words sliced through him like daggers, stripping away the last fragments of his identity. He was crushed under the weight of his own fears, unable to fight back or find any reason to try. Lucas was in an even worse condition. He no longer seemed human. His vacant eyes stared into the forest, as if seeing something beyond the physical. "They don't know who you are, Lucas. But I do. I've always known." The forest seemed to revel in their suffering, feeding on their guilt, fear, and regret. The bond that had once united the friends now tore them apart, leaving only shards of who they used to be. Renata eventually found Clara lying at the base of a tree, her eyes unfocused and her breathing shallow. The weight of her sister's accusations had finally crushed her spirit. "Clara," Renata shouted, shaking her, but there was no response. She fell to her knees beside her friend, trembling. That's when she heard it. The final whisper, louder and more menacing than anything before. It wasn't a voice from her past or a memory. It was the forest itself, deep and unyielding, resonating through the trees. "Now you are mine. Your souls are mine to consume." Renata had no strength left to fight. All that remained was the forest's overwhelming darkness, which enveloped them entirely, consuming their bodies and souls. And so the forest remained, silent, unchanging, as though nothing had ever happened. The whispers faded into nothingness, leaving only an eternal void where a group of friends had once existed.